Review of Radical Political Economics Volume 26, 1, 134-148, 1994, Veblen and the Business Cycle. A Marxist Perspective. Adil Mohammed. Abstract. Many economists have explained Veblen's business cycle either by concentrating on competition, demand, etc., or by stressing Veblen's Nanchal fragility theory. In this article, it is argued that Veblen has combined the rising labor cost theory with Nanchal fragility theory to explain downturns in business activity. For Veblen, capitalism is not capable of eliminating business cycles because of the competitive friction between business capital and workers. The basic objective of this article is to provide a lucid radical interpretation for Veblen's business cycle as a manifestation of class struggle. Using numerous quotations from Veblen's writings, this article contends that Veblen has combined the rising labor cost theory with a Nanchal fragility theory in order to explain downturns in business activity. In contrast to this contention, many economists have furnished different interpretations of Veblen's theory of the business cycle. In fact, they have interpreted Veblen's business cycle either by concentrating on variables such as competition, demand, etc., or by stressing Veblen's Nanchal fragility theory, which is an effect, rather than a cause, of a crisis. By interpreting Veblen in such ways, those economists have actually downplayed Veblen's radical treatment of labor as the precipitator of crises. This misplaced emphasis can only be remedied by providing an appropriate, radical interpretation to Veblen's business cycle, an interpretation which is inferred from, and essentially compatible with, Veblen's economic framework. As a matter of fact, this alternative radical interpretation is intended to place Veblen among such great crisis theorists as Marx and other radicals. And this task drives the choice of the current title to this article. It is indeed a Marxist perspective to Veblen's business cycle because Veblen analyzes the business cycle through concepts such as business and industry, salesmanship and workmanship, combined workmen and combined businesses, etc. Concepts that carry in their essence the idea of class struggle. In addition, although Marxists will not learn from Veblen a new theory of crisis, Veblen's theory can be a supplement to Marx's general framework of sectoral imbalance, Hunt 1979, 128-129. Section 2 will critically analyze the various interpretations of Veblen's business cycle, while Veblen's radical theory as interpreted in this study is rigorously outlined in Section 3. Section 4 is devoted to articulating the basic conclusion of this study, which explicitly suggests that the only cure for business cycles is the radical transformation of capitalism to a new socio-economic system where class conflict does not exist. The dominant interpretations of Veblen's business cycle. Paul Sweezy argues that Veblen sees depression as a result of technological advance and capitalization. Sweezy contends that the machine process gives rise to large-scale production which results in the corporate form of business, whose intention is shifted from producing useful goods and services to the sale and manipulation of corporate securities. Sweezy believes, it is in this context that the consequences of continuous, and indeed accelerating, technological advance must be assessed. As Veblen saw it, the primary effect was a continuous lowering of production costs. With new machines able to produce more cheaply than the old, the result could only be a steady undermining of existing capitalization, 1958, 22. Hence, a chronic depression occurs. For Veblen, it is true that technological advance lowers the cost of production and causes difficulty to weak RMS by reducing prices, but it is not the main cause of undermining capitalization. In fact, if lower costs and prices, as suggested by Sweezy, are accompanied by a larger volume of output and lower interest rates, it will lead to enhanced, not undermined, capitalization. What Sweezy overlooks is the proposition provided by Veblen, that the friction between workers and business, manifested by higher cost of labor and lower efficiency, that is accompanied by lower prices and higher interest rates will undermine capitalization and throw the economy into a chronic depression. Brocky interprets Veblen's business cycle as resulting from decreasing profit margin. When purchases increase, prices will increase, leading businesses to launch new investment, which leads, in turn, to increased demand and higher prices. When prices rise, profit margins increase markedly. Ultimately, however, even though farm prices, and raw material prices, may not increase and a cheapening of the processes of production might occur, the total expenses of production overtake or nearly overtake the prospective selling price of output. As profit margin decreases. 1958, 116 to 117, a depression gets underway. Although it is true that the decline of profit causes a depression, Brocky does not explain how and why profit declines. Is it due to increased cost, to lowered prices, or what? Overlooking these inquiries means ignoring the fundamental causes of Veblen's crisis. This explains the inappropriateness of Brocky's interpretation. Sowell believes Veblen's theory of the business cycle as distinguished from his characterization of it were entirely non-Marxian and distinctly his own, 1967, 186. He argues, for Veblen depression was a result of declining profitability of older capital with its high XED charges based on its prospective earning power as of the time of its original investment. It was not the Keynesian decline in the marginal efficiency of new capital relative to the interest rate, but the decline in the prospective earnings of older capital relative to the interest rate, that was important, 1967, 186. Sowell, however, left unexplained the reasons behind the decline in the prospective earnings of the older capital. The expected earnings can decline as a result of increases in cost, low prices, decline in output, and higher interest rates. But for Veblen, the basic factor, as we shall see, is the labor cost per unit of output, which is associated with lower prices and higher interest rates. Arrow argues that the course of a boom is marked by growing accumulation of debt as a result of business expansion. But when lenders begin to realize that older RMS tend to become overcapitalized relative to newer ones, loans are called or not renewed because the rates of return of the old RMS become too low to justify the existence of these RMS. Hence, the declining rate of return causes a depression. Arrow completes his analysis of Veblen's business cycle by bringing in the policy tools recommended by Veblen for avoiding the declining rates of return. Arrow argues, Veblen foresaw consolidation of industry as a means for avoiding the downward drift of capitalization, but that consolidation could never be complete. When the last step in business coalition has been taken, there remains the competitive friction between the combined business capital and the combined workmen, 1975, 8. Veblen and the Business Cycle, a Marxist Perspective 137. When Arrow sees his analysis from theory to policy, he indeed reams a basic contradiction in his argument. If Veblen con the cause of the business cycle to a decline in the rates of return, why would Veblen introduce the connect between businesses and workmen? The answer is very simple in that the declining rates of return are not the cause of the business cycle, rather, they are the effect. Donald Walker, evaluating Veblen's economic system, explains two phenomena analyzed by Veblen: bankruptcy and nature of depression. Veblen's bankruptcy, according to Walker, is brought about by technological change and overcapitalization. Walker believes that technological changes enable capital goods to be produced at lower cost, and through competition between businesses a fall in the prices of output is inevitable. Businesses that do not have the new capital goods have relatively high costs, and can't make adequate profits, 1977, 225. For overcapitalization, Walker argues, businesses tend to become overcapitalized during a period of prosperity. During an ensuing period of lower prices for their products, the interest that they have to pay and their other liabilities become excessive in relation to earnings, their profits are eliminated, and they are forced into bankruptcy, 1977, 225. As far as the nature of depression is concerned, Walker argues, Veblen's opinions on the nature of depression and prosperity are difficult to reconcile, 1977, 227. Walker believes that Veblen sometimes asserts that depressions are characterized by an appreciable curtailment of industry, but he also argues that a depression is mainly a readjustment of values, a change of ownership. Walker continues. Depression, Veblen explained, is primarily a psychological fact, a malady of the affections of the businessman, 1977, 227. The problems with Walker's interpretation are obvious. First, Walker's argument of lower prices and higher interest rates is insufficient to generate lower capitalization. This is because, if prices decline and interest rates increase but cost decreases at a faster rate, then capitalization will increase. Again, capitalization, Veblen argues, will decline if cost of production, mainly labor cost, increases, provided there are lower prices and higher interest rates. Second, with respect to depression, it seems that there is consistency between Veblen's argument that depression is a change of ownership, a readjustment of value, and a psychological fact. This is so because during depression large capitalists purchase properties of small capitalists at lower prices. After depression is over, capitalists are usually able to adjust the values of their properties upward as a result of higher prices relative to the prices prevalent during depression. And depression is a psychological fact because it is chronic under capitalism and consequently creates a malady as long as profits decline. Professor Hunt, whose analysis and comparison of Marx and Veblen is the best in the literature, believes, Veblen described a process in which business investment is originally capitalized in accordance with the initial estimates of its prospective earning power. Over time, however, the earning power of older capital declines relative to new investments. This creates an overcapitalization of corporations' assets, 1979, 129. And when this happens, there is slight and doubtful provision for a shrinkage of earnings, consequently, economic crisis follows. Professor Hunt, because of the many elements he discusses in his penetrating article, has not explained in detail Veblen's business cycle. In fact, Professor Hunt left unexplained the reasons behind the decline in the earning power of older capital. However, Professor Hunt indicates correctly that in a situation of a shrinkage of earnings, economic crisis can bring corporations' aiming and capitalized assets back into balance, 1979, 129, a proposition overlooked by Walker, 1977, but stressed by Veblen. Dillard argues that in Veblen's case changing expectations about future profits are the chief disruptive force leading to crisis and depression, 1980, 262. Dillard explains that by stating, unstable profit expectations cause frequent changes in the capitalized value of business RMS. When the change in profit expectation is drastic, arising, for example, from the failure of a major banking house, massive liquidation occurs and may throw the economy into a crisis, 1980, 262. There are several problems with Dillard's interpretations of Veblen's business cycle. First, Dillard does not furnish quotations from Veblen supporting his proposition that expectations about future profit lead to a crisis. Second, the financial crisis is actually a manifestation of the crisis in the real sector. That is, when profit share declines because of increased labor cost per unit of output, RMS liquidate their products to obtain cash or resort to banks for credits. But banks usually do not provide cash to RMS whose profits are squeezed, hence, liquidation is the normal course of action. In other words, for Veblen, liquidation occurs ere profit has declined, not after a major bank collapses. Third, Dillard is not sure whether liquidation will throw the economy into crisis, whereas Veblen believes that liquidation is a basic symptom of a crisis. Morosky analyzes Veblen's business cycle through the equation PL equals RSIL/LL equals P/N, 1, where PR is the rate of profit, P is the net profit, N is the net wealth, R is the gross profit margin on sales, net of interest, L is leverage, liabilities/assets, I is the rate of interest, and S is the ratio of sales to assets in any given time period. Morosky contends that if R is assumed to be XED and I is given, then ARM with leverage, L, will experience a high proportional rise in the rate of prod, PR, if S increases. On the other hand, if the net margin varies over time, a higher level of leverage will exaggerate movements in the prod rate, 1985-40. Moreover, if sales per unit asset S vary, a higher level of leverage will exaggerate its impact on the rate of prod, 1985-40. Thus, besides sufficient sales, Morozki argues, leverage is a very important factor in explaining Veblen's business cycle. He states, as it was, Veblen simply believed the cycle was one of RST increasing and then decreasing leverage, 1985-40. Compactly, Morozki concludes, if the rate of interest I on loans is less than the RM's existing rate of prod, and if the RM is successful in increasing its sales, then the result of this strategy will be an extended financial turnover, i.e., more sales relative to the same net worth, and a higher rate of prod. On the other hand, if the new investment cannot be translated into increased sales, the level of financial turnover will remain constant and the rate of prod will fall, subjecting the RM to possible risk of failure, 1985, 139-140. Given the above argument, Morozki believes Veblen did not see that he left unexplained the level of aggregate activity, aggregate sales, and therefore did not develop a complete model of the business cycles, 1985-40. However, Morozki does recognize an essential fact by stating, for the RST time since Marx, Veblen locates the direct responsibility of the business cycle in the behavior of the class whose function is the accumulation of capital, 1985-34. Professor Mirzirovsky's analysis has a problem in that it does not explain what would happen if R declined, a decline usually caused by the rise in labor costs as Veblen argues. If R declines, loans will not be renewed and might be called. In other words, the decline in leverage is an essential effect of the decline in R, caused basically by the rise in labor cost per unit of output, the cause. This fact was left unexplained by Morozki and other economists. Professor Wolfson contends that during prosperity two things occur, actual prots increase, and so do expectations about future prots, 1986-14. The increase in actual and expected prots is generated during prosperity when the selling prices overtake the cost of production, since the advance in the cost of labor is relatively slow. The increase in actual and expected earnings leads to augmentation of the values of properties and hence the amount of credits. Augmented properties are used as collateral for new credits. The prosperity will eventually lead to a financial crisis. Wolfson demonstrates, thus, for Veblen, a financial crisis is the process of liquidation of the expanded credit that had been built up during prosperity. It is brought on because expectations of lower profitability lead to a lower capitalization of assets and a restriction of credit, 1986-15. Wolfson explains the reasons for the decline in earnings by the reduction in the differential advantage, PROTS, the difference between the prospective selling prices and the cost of production. Professor Wolfson's interpretation does not distinguish between the early and late phase of prosperity. Cost of labor increases at a slow rate during the early phase of prosperity but increases at a higher rate during the late phase of prosperity. Also, Professor Wolfson does not explain why the differential advantage declines. In other words, is this decline due to increased cost or decreased revenue? If this is so, then what is the variable, S, causing the cost to rise or the revenue to decline? Professor Wolfson provides no answers. Before closing this section, it should be noted that the technological reason, introduced to interpret Veblen's theory of the business cycle, is inconsistent with Veblen's theory. LFRMs whose technology is new reduce their costs and older technology RMS collapse, then why does Veblen refer to the increase in money wages prior to a downturn? This is a clear contradiction because, if RMS are losing and in the process of liquidation, then money wages should decline, rather than increase, as a result of excess supply of labor. Veblen's theory of the business cycle production, according to Veblen, is both a social and cultural process. In the production process, human beings share knowledge and skills and cooperate socially to satisfy human wants. However, production under the system of private property is not undertaken to satisfy human needs. Veblen argues that the basic motive behind production is to achieve what he terms reasonable profits. Stated somewhat differently, the volume of output is determined to attain a satisfactory profit, which is a manifestation of the predatory instinct of the vested interests, capitalists, who are aiming at domestic and international dominance. But how is the volume of production determined to achieve reasonable profits? Veblen gives a clear-cut answer. He accurately realizes that the vested interests determine the volume of output after taking into consideration actual and expected aggregate demand. Indeed, based upon careful estimation of these demands, the output level is determined. As Veblen explains, the rate and volume of output must be adjusted to the needs of the market, not to the working capacity of the available resources, equipment, and manpower, nor to communities' need of consumable goods. 1921, 9. And the market's needs mean the volume of effective demand. 1923, 302, which implies a level of output yielding reasonable profits. Moreover, business enterprises extend their production and operations, ventures, as long as actual and expected demand are sufficient to absorb the supply of output. As Veblen points out, in part by actual increase of demand and in part through a lively anticipation of an advanced demand, aggressive business enterprise extends its venture. 1904, 195. Thus, the whole volume of output as well as the expansionary process are determined by aggregate demand, assuming the existence of sufficient profits to the vested interests. Given a sufficient level of aggregate demand and reasonable prices and profits, market capitalization will increase. Veblen states, increased demand and enhanced prices increase the prospective earnings of the several concerns engaged. 1904, 197. In turn, the expectations of increased earnings, which is in substance an apprehended differential gain in increased selling prices of the output over the expenses of production of the output. 1904, 199, leads the businessmen to bid high for equipment and supplies, and thereby the effective market capitalization is increased. 1904, 197, and so will the collateral and volume of credit. For Veblen, credit serves two main uses: a. deferred payment in the purchase and sales of goods, and b. loans or debts, notes, shares, interest-bearing securities, deposit, call loans, and the like. 1904, 92. But the second use of credit indicates the means of increasing the magnitude of the turnover volume of business 1904, 95, that can be determined, see Veblen 19042-95, by T equals 1/T, C plus 1/N, C, 2, where T is time, C is the capital used as collateral for credit extension, and 1/N, C is the credit, which is an indeterminate fraction of capital. 1904, 95. Veblen states, the effect of credit on the part of a businessman is the same as if his capital had been turned over a greater number of times in the year. It is accordingly to his interest to extend his credit as far as his standing and the state of the market will admit. 1904, 95. And the relationship between the volume of credit and capitalization can be shown in equations 3, 4, and 5, see Veblen 1904, 198. Ca equals 1/N, K, 3, K equals M and E equals, M, 0, equals, P, 3, 0, where E is earnings, P is the sale price of output, C is the expenses of production, M is the margin of gain on output, or M equals P, C, K is the effective market capitalization, CR is the normal credit extension, O is the output, and I is the interest rate. Veblen 1904, 203-204. The differential advantage, M, on which prosperity rests arises from three sources according to Veblen. First, as prosperity starts and prices rise, given that some remote lines of industry such as farming and other raw materials are less affected by the new favorable price disturbance, 1904, 199 to 200, as others are, the RMS affected by price changes will generate differential advantages. Second, the chief and most secure differential advantage is due to the relatively slow advance in the cost of labor, 1904, 199 to 200, during the early phase of prosperity. Third, a progressive cheapening of the process of production caused by new technology lowers the cost of production relative to the contracted prices of the products, 1904, 200. Thus, these reasons keep the cost of production low and make the profit margin high as long as prices are reasonable during a prosperity period. But prosperity does not continue under the system of private property because of the reduction of the differential advantage, M. The weak branches of industry lose their differential advantage as prosperity continues. This is because these RMS, according to Veblen, are forced by circumstances technological inefficiency to deliver their output at prices which preclude its obtaining such a margin, 1904, 202. Moreover, as prosperity continues, the cost of labor increases, and the differential advantage decreases. For Veblen, increasing money wages is the primary cause of the business cycle. He reasons, much of the business advantage gained in an era of prosperity is due to the fact that wages advance more tardily than the prices of goods. An era of prosperity does not commonly bring an increase of wages until the era is about to close. The advance of wages is not only a symptom indicating that the season of prosperity is passing, but it is a business factor which must by its own proper effect close the season as soon as the advance in wages becomes somewhat general. Increasing wages cut away the securest ground of that differential price advantage on which an era of prosperity runs, 1904, 212. Furthermore, the large volume of outstanding credit obligations will increase the cost of business and narrow the profit margin. Veblen explains, there is always a considerable amount of interest-bearing securities outstanding, and the claims of these securities have to be satisfied before dividends can be paid on stocks. These XED charges, together with others of a like kind, narrow the margin from which profits are derived and increases the handicap which a season of dull time brings to the businessmen in charge of industry, 1904, 217 to 218. Parenthetically, when current interest rates advance, securities bearing a XED rate, of dividend or interest, decline on the market, 1904, 222n. This reduction of the profit margin is exacerbated by the inability of businesses to increase prices. Veblen outlines several variables preventing the prices from rising. First, the lower cost of capital goods of the new establishments generates a large supply of products, 1904, 219. Second, competition, no collusive control on output and prices, leads to a price cutting, 1904, 230. Third, the limited amount of precious metal, quantity of money, becomes an obstacle to price increases. These various circumstances, increased cost and decreased prices, lead to the reduction of the differential advantage. But labor cost, for Veblen, is the essential source for generating this reduction and hence causing a depression. This proposition can be substantiated either by Veblen's writings. In his Absentee Ownership, Veblen clearly states the mechanism of the business cycle. Veblen starts his analysis by contending that the source of profits is the margin of sales price over production cost, Veblen 1923, 400. This margin is widened by raising the level of sales prices, both by efficient salesmanship in the merchandising trade and by a continued expansion of the outstanding volume of purchasing power through a continued creation of credits, 1923, 400. In addition, the profit margin increases if the businessmen are able to buy the industrial manpower as cheap as may be, 1923, 400. But workers have a different plan. As Veblen describes the situation, while the businessmen are endeavoring to enhance the reasonable gains by widening the margin of sales prices over productive zero-end costs, the organized workmen are forever cutting in on the same margin by pushing up the labor cost, 1923, 403. Usually, the organized workers do that successfully because they have more strength than capitalists in the late period of an expansion, a period when the labor market becomes very tight as a result of increased demand for labor. The depletion of the reserve army. The organized workers negotiate with their employers for higher wages, or what Veblen calls to sell as dear as may be, 1923, 401. In these negotiations, workers' principal recourse is a limitation of the supply, a strategic withdrawal of efficiency by means of strike, union rules, and devices for consuming time unproductively, L 923, 402. But the rise in wages without a corresponding increase in the workmanlike efficiency of the wage earners acts in its degree to increase the labor cost per unit of the marketable output of industry, and therefore also to narrow the margin of sales price over production cost, 1923, 393. When PROT declines, given high costs of doing business and lower prices, market capitalization declines, and so does credit extension. Consequently, a process of liquidation starts in which creditors press their claims. To meet demand for their creditors, businesses, whose capitalized values decline, call upon their debtors, who may in turn hold loans on collateral, a block of securities representing capitalized wealth. But there is an apprehension that the collateral is OVI capitalized, therefore, a sequence of liquidation is initiated. In other words, the Veblen and the business cycle, a Marxist perspective. 145 Liquidation starts because of the discrepancy between the earlier effective capitalization on which collateral has been accepted and the current effective capitalization of the same collateral shown by quotations and sales of the securities on the market, 1904, 193. Overall, the increases in money wages and the decreases in worker efficiency lead to a situation described by Veblen as follows: the necessary expenses of production overtake or nearly overtake the prospective selling price of the output. The differential advantage, on which business prosperity rests, then fails, the rate of earnings falls off, the enhanced capitalization based on enhanced putative earnings proves greater than the earnings realized or in prospect on the basis of an enhanced scale of expenses of production, the collateral consequently shrinks to a point where it will not support the credit extension resting on it in the way of outstanding contracts and loans, and liquidation ensues, Veblen 1904, 200-201. Indeed, Veblen has combined a financial fragility theory with a rising labor cost to try to explain the precipitation into crisis. This is because the increased PROTs and earnings lead to two problematic outcomes. The RST outcome is related to capitalization. According to Veblen, businesses are capitalized on their capacity to produce earnings, not on their capacity to produce goods, and their capitalization has in effect been calculated and exceeded on the highest ordinary rate of earnings previously obtained, 1921, 107. When T has large earnings, free income, are capitalized, their capitalized value has been added to corporate capital and covered with securities bearing a XED income charge. This income charge has thereby become a liability on the earnings of the corporation. This liability cannot be met in case the concern's net aggregate earnings fall off in any degree, 1921, 14-15. That is, Veblen argues, any appreciable decrease in the net earnings of the business will bring it face to face with bankruptcy, 1921, 14. The second outcome is related to labor, which is responsible for the reduction of the net earnings. Veblen contends, the continued flow of credits and capitalization continues to expand the volume of purchasing power in the market, and so continues to enhance the price cost of living for the workman, along with the rising level of general prices, 1923, 402. However, the increased price level provokes the organized workman to a more assiduous bargaining for higher wages, which calls for a more instant mobilization in the way of strikes, 1923, 402. On the other extreme, the absentee owners with whom the workmen are carrying on their acrimonious argument about wages and livelihood, 1923, 402, have learned to act in concert and have also learned that, in a business way, the industrial manpower is their common enemy, 1923, 402 to 403. Given this antagonistic environment between workers and businesses, Veblen concludes, the organization, animus, and tactics of these industrial workmen have been brought to such a point of business-like efficiency as to constitute a menace to reasonable earnings and to a reasonable balanced rhythm on the outstanding capitalization. Therefore, since prosperity depends on a continued free run of earnings on the outstanding capitalization, the business-like attitude and tactics of the organized workmen are also a menace to the prosperity of the community at large, 1923, 408. In a nutshell, as earnings increase, the captains of Nans, as Veblen calls them, 1921, 52, inevitably issue more and more securities to enhance their own financial holdings, but the interest and other payments on the securities become higher and higher. XED charges on the profit stream generated by the underlying enterprise are overcapitalized. The enterprise becomes more and more precariously over-leveraged until nearly a slight interruption in their profit stream due to a rising cost of labor begins to throw a large number of them into financial default. The defaults accumulate into a general financial crisis of liquidation. And this interpretation of Veblen's business cycle is radical relative to the other interpretations that have emphasized Veblen's financial fragility theory and ignored Veblen's radical theory of rising labor cost. That is, most of Veblen's interpreters ignore Veblen's radical treatment of labor sabotage as the precipitator of crises. To complete his analysis, Veblen considers various remedies for business depression that are practiced under capitalism's business coalition for eliminating cutthroat competition and regulation of prices, 1904, 258, wasteful expenditures such as military spending, 1904, 251, by the state, the increased supply of the precious metals that acts to correct or mitigate the trend of business toward chronic depression, 1904, 235, imperialistic adventures, 1904, 252 and 295, and business sabotage, the conscientious withdrawal of efficiency, 1921, 6-20. Veblen contends that these remedies, including a complete business coalition, are not capable of eliminating the business cycle because of the friction, the inherent class conflict, between workers and businesses. Veblen states, the workmen do not and cannot own or direct the industrial equipment and processes, so long as ownership prevails and industry is to be managed on business principles. The working population can therefore not be included in the ideally complete business coalition, so that when the last step in business coalition has been taken, there remains the competitive friction between the combined business capital and the combined workmen, 1904, 265 to 266. TL1 et is, for Veblen, the chronic depression is the normal course of things in modern industrial business, 1904, 264. If this is so, then what should be done? Veblen suggests the abolition of private property, 1961, 398, by a revolution of industrial engineers and the establishment of socialism, 1923, 425. Indeed, socialism according to Veblen could save the situation by eliminating capitalism with its waste in consumption and production. Summary and conclusions. Veblen's theory of the business cycle wreaks the basic contradiction under capitalism between the combined workers and the combined businesses. That is, the major cause of a crisis is the struggle for income shares. When labor cost per unit of output increases as a result of more money, wages and lower productivity, a manifestation of class struggle, workers' income share increases at the expense of capitalists' income share. This rising cost of labor associated with the financial fragility of the business enterprise generates a financial crisis and a downturn in the economic activity. Within this environment of class struggle and financial fragility, the recurrence of the business cycle has become inevitable. This Vebelnian radical model has been overlooked by several economists including Veblen's followers. In fact, even Mitchell, while indicating the increase in money wages and the decrease in labor efficiency increased labor income share, neglects the social gist, or the sociology, of Veblen's theory, the friction between workers and businesses. Some of Veblen's interpreters, however, seem to have stressed Veblen's financial fragility theory and downplayed Veblen's radical theory of rising labor cost. This omission allows the interpreters to focus on financial reforms, example Mitchell 1941, 172 to 175, instead of on the need for a more radical transformation of the system. On this point, Professor Howard Sherman is the real authority, and his interpretation should be the definitive one. In this study, an attempt has been made to place Veblen among those radical economists who believe that capitalism with its institutions is not capable of eliminating business cycles. For Veblen, the means is lucid and revolutionary, abolishing private property and establishing socialism, a solution which is consistent with Professor Sherman's radical proposition: to eliminate the business cycle it is necessary to change to an alternative economic system, 1991, 386.